I still remember the way he looked at her, cold, dismissive, like she didn't belong there. The lawyer, Richard Caldwell, was known for being ruthless. He was tall, sharp-featured, and always dressed in an expensive navy blue suit. He had a reputation for tearing people apart in court, and today was no different. The woman sitting across from him was Evelyn Carter, a widow. She looked small in comparison, her hands tightly clasped together, her black dress slightly worn at the edges. There was something fragile about her, but there was also a quiet strength in her eyes. I sat in the back of the courtroom, watching it unfold. "Mrs. Carter," Richard began, his voice smooth but dripping with mockery. "You claim that your late husband's business shares were promised to you. Yet you have no proof, no written agreement, nothing but your word." Evelyn swallowed hard but didn't look away. "My husband told me he would leave them to me," she said softly. "He wanted to make sure I was taken care of." Richard scoffed. "How convenient, a verbal promise with no witnesses." "Mrs. Carter, are we really supposed to believe that?" A few people chuckled. The judge remained neutral, but I could see the doubt in his eyes too. I clenched my fists. Evelyn had lost her husband just a few months ago. Now his greedy business partners were trying to take everything from her. They had expensive lawyers, like Richard, who would do anything to win. Evelyn's lawyer, a middle-aged man named Mr. Daniels, stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Caldwell is badgering my client." The judge nodded. Sustained. "Mr. Caldwell, keep it professional." Richard smirked. "Of course, Your Honor." Then he turned back to Evelyn. "Mrs. Carter, without evidence, this case is simple. The company legally belongs to the other shareholders. You are asking this court to believe a story with no proof." Evelyn's hands trembled slightly, but then she did something unexpected. She reached into her handbag. For the first time that day, I saw a flicker of fear in Richard's eyes. "I do have proof," she said. The courtroom fell silent. Richard straightened, his confidence faltering for just a second. "Excuse me?" Evelyn pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. "This was written by my husband," she said, her voice stronger now. "And I believe it will change everything." I held my breath. Even Richard looked uneasy. Because suddenly, the case wasn't so simple anymore. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the rustling of papers on the judge's desk. All eyes were on Evelyn as she held the envelope in her trembling hands. Richard Caldwell's smirk had faded. He adjusted his tie, trying to regain his confidence. "Mrs. Carter," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Anyone can pull out a letter and claim it's important. What exactly do you have there?" Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deep breath and carefully opened the envelope. Her fingers brushed over the fragile paper inside, before she handed it to her lawyer, Mr. Daniels. "This," she said firmly, "is a handwritten letter from my husband, Charles Carter, addressed to me. In it, he clearly states his intention to leave his shares in the company to me after his passing." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Richard's jaw tightened. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "this is highly suspicious. Why wasn't this letter presented earlier?" Evelyn lifted her chin. "Because I only just found it." Richard let out an exaggerated sigh. "How convenient." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request to examine this so-called letter. We need to verify its authenticity before entertaining this nonsense any further." The judge nodded. "Mr. Daniels, please submit the letter for review." Mr. Daniels walked over and handed it to the court clerk, who carried it to the judge. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to read. The tension in the room was unbearable. I could see Evelyn gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. After a long moment, the judge finally looked up. "This letter appears to be signed and dated by Charles Carter," he said. "It also mentions a witness." "A witness?" Richard blinked. He hadn't expected that. "A witness?" he repeated, his voice slightly unsteady. "Who?" Evelyn turned her gaze directly at him. "Mr. Thomas Reynolds, my husband's former business partner." At the mention of the name, Richard's face paled, because Thomas Reynolds had been one of the people siding against Evelyn in this case. And now, everything had changed. The air in the courtroom turned heavy. Richard Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His usual confidence was cracking, and for the first time he seemed uncertain. Thomas Reynolds, a name that carried weight. A man who had once been Charles Carter's closest friend and business partner, until greed got in the way. The judge's gaze hardened. Mr. Daniels, do we have any confirmation that Mr. Reynolds witnessed this letter? Mr. Daniels cleared his throat. Your Honor, my client was unaware of this letter until recently. However, if this signature belongs to Thomas Reynolds, then we have a direct witness to Mr. Carter's final wishes. He turned to Evelyn. Mrs. Carter, do you believe Mr. Reynolds will confirm this in court? Evelyn's voice was steady. I believe he will, because he was once an honest man. Richard let out a sharp laugh, but it lacked his usual arrogance. Your Honor, this is absurd. Thomas Reynolds has sided with the company against Mrs. Carter. Do you honestly think he'll support this so-called evidence? The judge nodded. Then let's find out. I am ordering Mr. Reynolds to appear in court for questioning. We will continue once we have his testimony. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Richard Caldwell's hands curled into fists. This wasn't going the way he had planned. Evelyn finally allowed herself a small breath of relief. She wasn't naive. She knew Thomas Reynolds had betrayed her husband by siding with the other shareholders. But she also knew something else. There had been a time when Thomas Reynolds and Charles Carter were like brothers. And if there was still a shred of decency left in him, he wouldn't be able to deny the truth. As the judge adjourned the session, I watched Richard Caldwell storm out of the courtroom, his usual smugness replaced with frustration. Evelyn remained seated, her hands still trembling, but now, for the first time, there was hope in her eyes, because the truth was finally coming to light. The next day, the courtroom was packed. Everyone was waiting for one man, Thomas Reynolds. Evelyn sat quietly, her fingers clasped together in her lap. I could tell she was nervous, but there was also something else in her expression. Determination. Richard Caldwell, on the other hand, looked tense. He kept checking his watch, shifting in his seat. He had built his case on the assumption that Evelyn had no proof. Now everything depended on Thomas Reynolds. When the doors finally opened and Reynolds walked in, the entire courtroom went silent. He was a tall man, older, with graying hair and deep lines on his face. He looked uneasy as he took the stand, avoiding Evelyn's gaze. Mr. Reynolds, the judge began, you have been called to testify regarding a letter written by the late Charles Carter. You are alleged to have been a witness to this document. Is that correct? Thomas hesitated. His eyes flickered to Richard Caldwell, who gave him a sharp look, a warning. For a long moment, I thought he was going to lie. Then he let out a heavy breath. Yes, he said quietly. I witnessed Charles writing that letter. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few shocked exclamations filled the air. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears, not just from relief, but from something deeper. Maybe heartbreak, knowing her husband's best friend had stayed silent for so long. Richard Caldwell shot up from his seat. Objection, Your Honor, this is highly questionable. Mr. Reynolds has already aligned himself with the other shareholders. Why would he suddenly change his story? The judge banged his gavel. Overruled. Mr. Reynolds, please explain why you did not disclose this information earlier. Thomas swallowed hard. He finally turned to look at Evelyn. Because I was ashamed, he admitted. Charles was my best friend. I knew he wanted his wife to have those shares. But when he passed, the other partners convinced me to stay quiet. They said the company would fall apart without new leadership, that it was better this way. He looked down. I let greed and fear cloud my judgment. Evelyn blinked back tears. And now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas met her eyes, guilt written all over his face. Now, I can't live with the lie anymore. Richard Caldwell looked furious. His entire case was crumbling before his eyes. The judge turned to him. Mr. Caldwell, given this testimony and the letter's authenticity, do you still wish to contest Mrs. Carter's claim? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was trapped. Finally, after a long silence, he clenched his jaw and muttered, No further objections, Your Honor. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. She had won. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom. Richard Caldwell, the once ruthless lawyer, sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. His arrogance was gone. He had lost. Evelyn Carter, the widow he had mocked and dismissed, had just proven everyone wrong. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Given the newly presented evidence, the court finds that Charles Carter did indeed intend to leave his business shares to his wife, Evelyn Carter. The claim by the other shareholders is hereby dismissed." Evelyn gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hands. Her lawyer, Mr. Daniels, gently patted her shoulder, but she could barely move. The realization was sinking in. She had won. The other shareholders, who had fought so hard to take everything from her, exchanged nervous glances. Some whispered among themselves. Their plan had fallen apart, and there was nothing they could do about it. But my eyes were on Richard Caldwell. His hands were balled into fists, his usually perfect posture slightly hunched. He had built his career on humiliating people like Evelyn, crushing them under legal technicalities. But this time he had underestimated the quiet strength of a grieving widow. As the judge stood and prepared to leave, Richard abruptly rose to his feet. "Your Honor, I—" The judge gave him a sharp look. "Mr. Caldwell, the case is closed." Richard's mouth opened, then shut. His shoulders sagged. He had nothing left to say. Evelyn, still trembling, finally turned to Thomas Reynolds. He had been silent since his testimony, his face lined with guilt. "Why did you wait so long?" she asked softly. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "Because I was weak, and because I convinced myself that you would never win." He met her gaze, shame filling his eyes. "But you did." For a moment I thought Evelyn might lash out at him, demand answers, demand justice for what he had put her through, but instead she just nodded slowly. "Charles believed in you," she said. "I just wish you had believed in yourself sooner." Thomas swallowed hard, unable to speak. As Evelyn slowly gathered her things, her fingers trembled slightly, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was the weight of everything. The endless nights of worry, the heartbreak of being doubted, the exhaustion of fighting a battle she never asked for. And now, it was over. She carefully placed the letter back into her bag, the very proof that had saved her, before rising from her seat. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Richard Caldwell watching her. His expression was unreadable, but something about his posture had changed. The arrogance that had dripped from his every word earlier was gone. His shoulders were tense, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Maybe he was struggling to accept his defeat. Maybe he was wondering how a widow he had so easily dismissed had managed to turn the case around. Or maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to realize that not every battle is won by intimidation. That truth, resilience, and quiet strength could be more powerful than any legal trick. But whatever was running through his mind, he didn't say a word, not a single snide remark, not a last attempt to shake her. Nothing. He just stood there as she walked past him, her head held high, her steps steady, her dignity intact. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and as Evelyn stepped outside, the crisp afternoon air greeted her. The sunlight touched her face, warm and gentle, as if the universe itself was acknowledging her victory. She paused, closing her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. For months, she had carried the unbearable weight of uncertainty. She had been doubted, humiliated, pushed to the edge, but she had never given up. And now, standing there with the world moving around her, she finally felt it. Relief, freedom, justice. She had fought for what was right, and she had won. If you enjoyed this story and love seeing justice served, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life. Comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Evelyn's place? We love hearing your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an incredible story like this. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family, because everyone loves a good dose of karma.